Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1876. Lucas Newell smeared mud across his face and swore under his breath. A man needed hands to run a cattle operation, that much was certain. But why was it that every cowboy who'd answered his advertisement seemed more interested in whiskey than work? The last one had lasted precisely 2 weeks before disappearing with a month's advance and Lucas's second-best saddle. "Mr. Newell," came the voice from behind him. "Supper's ready whenever you are." Lucas turned to see his cook standing in the doorway of the ranch house, her figure silhouetted against the warm light inside. He nodded curtly, reminded once again that at least one of his hires had proven reliable. "Thank you, Miss Zellinger. I'll be in directly." Julia Zellinger stepped back inside without another word, leaving Lucas to wash up at the pump. By the time he entered the kitchen, she had already disappeared into her small room off the back of the house, as was her custom. His plate sat waiting on the table, the stew still steaming alongside fresh-baked bread. Lucas ate alone, as he had for the 6 months since Julia had arrived to answer his advertisement for a cook. She kept to herself, did her work without complaint, and never joined him at meals. It suited Lucas fine. After his wife Caroline died in childbirth 3 years earlier, taking their infant daughter with her, he preferred the silence. But tonight, something caught his attention. A small leather-bound book lay on the bench opposite his chair. It hadn't been there earlier. Lucas wiped his hands and reached for it, expecting a receipt book or household ledger. Instead, he found sketches, dozens of them, landscapes of his ranch, capturing the rugged beauty of the mountains behind his property, detailed drawings of his horses, so lifelike he could almost hear them nickering, and portraits, the old rancher from down the valley, the blacksmith's children, and even one of Lucas himself, his expression far gentler than he ever saw in his shaving mirror. He turned the page and froze. There was a portrait of Caroline, his late wife, smiling exactly as he remembered. Lucas's hands trembled. He had no photographs of Caroline. They'd been too expensive. Yet here she was, captured perfectly on paper. How could Miss Zellinger have known what Caroline looked like? The sound of the bedroom door opening startled him. He closed the book quickly, but not before Julia caught sight of it in his hands. Her eyes widened with alarm. I beg your pardon, Mr. Newell," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to leave that." Lucas held the book out to her. "These drawings, they're remarkable." A blush crept up her neck as she took the book from him. "Thank you, sir." "The portrait of my wife," Lucas said, the words catching in his throat. "How did you know what she looked like?" Julia's fingers tightened around the book. "Mrs. Mitchell at the general store described her to me. She said you and your wife used to come to town together." She hesitated. "I hope I haven't offended you." Lucas shook his head, unable to speak for a moment. "You haven't," he finally managed. It's been a long time since I've seen her face so clearly." Something shifted in the air between them. For the first time, Lucas truly looked at Julia Zellinger. Not as his cook, but as a woman. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her simple calico dress was worn but clean. But it was her eyes that caught him, deep blue and intelligent, with a spark that suggested there was much more to her than the quiet, efficient cook he'd come to take for granted. "Why did you draw her?" Lucas asked. Julia looked down at her hands. "Mr. Mitchell mentioned you had no photograph. I thought, perhaps someday you might want something to remember her by." She stepped back toward her room. "Good night, Mr. Newell." Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving Lucas with the memory of Caroline's smile and the realization that he knew almost nothing about the woman who had lived under his roof for half a year. The next morning, Lucas rose before dawn, as was his habit. He was surprised to find Julia already in the kitchen, kneading dough by lamplight. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up at this hour, Mr. Newell," she replied without looking up from her work. "You're usually gone before I bring the coffee." It was true, Lucas realized. He typically headed straight to the stables, grabbing his coffee on the way out. How many other things about his daily life had he failed to notice? "Miss Zellinger," he began, then paused, unsure how to proceed. "I wondered if you might join me for supper this evening." Her hands stilled in the dough. "Join you?" "Yes. I've been thinking that it's impolite of me to have you prepare meals and never share them." Julia resumed her kneading, her movements methodical. "As you wish, Mr. Newell." That evening, for the first time, Julia sat across from Lucas at the table. She had changed into a clean dress that, while still simple, showed touches of careful mending and embroidery around the collar. With her hair arranged more carefully than usual and sitting upright in the lamplight, Lucas was struck by how different she appeared from the shadow who moved quietly through his house. "How did you learn to draw like that?" he asked after several minutes of awkward silence. Julia took a small sip of water. "My father was an artist. Not famous, but skilled. He taught me when I was young." "Yet you work as a cook?" A small smile touched her lips. "Women have few opportunities to make a living with art, Mr. Newell. Cooking puts food on the table, my own table, that is." Lucas found himself increasingly curious about this woman he had barely acknowledged for months. "Where are you from originally, Miss Zellinger?" "Boston, originally. My father died when I was 16. I worked as a governess until the war ended, then decided to come west." "Alone?" Lucas couldn't hide his surprise. Most women traveled west with husbands or family. "Yes," she said simply. "I wanted to see the landscapes my father had only read about. The Rockies, the plains." Her voice grew softer. "I had little to keep me in Boston." As they continued to talk, Lucas discovered that Julia had been educated at a respectable girls' school, spoke French, and had traveled through much of the eastern United States before coming west. She was well-read and knowledgeable about topics ranging from literature to politics. Yet she had chosen to work as a cook in a remote ranch in Wyoming Territory. "There's something I don't understand," Lucas said as they finished their meal. "With your education and talents, you could be teaching in town or working as a companion to a wealthy family in Denver. Why here?" Julia was quiet for so long that Lucas thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried an edge he hadn't heard before. "Sometimes, Mr. Newell, a woman needs to disappear for a while." Before he could ask what she meant, the sound of hoofbeats approached the house. Lucas rose to his feet, reaching for the rifle he kept by the door. Few visitors arrived after dark with good intentions. "Stay here," he told Julia, but she was already clearing the dishes with practiced efficiency, her face once again composed into the mask of his invisible cook. Lucas opened the door to find Sheriff Tom Miller dismounting from his horse. "Evening, Lucas," the sheriff said, removing his hat. "Sorry to trouble you so late. Is your cook at home?" Lucas felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. "Miss Zellinger? What business do you have with her?" The sheriff's expression grew serious. "There's a man in town asking after her. Says he's her husband." Behind him, Lucas heard a plate shatter on the floor. Julia stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, her face drained of color. "That's impossible," she whispered. The sheriff looked past Lucas to where Julia stood. "He's got marriage papers, ma'am. Name of Edward Harrington. Says you left Philadelphia without a word 18 months ago." Lucas turned to Julia, confusion and something like betrayal washing over him. "You said you were from Boston, and you never mentioned being married." Julia's hands trembled at her sides. "I'm not. That is, I was, but—" She stopped, drawing a deep breath. "Edward Harrington is dead. He died in a factory accident 2 years ago." "Well, he seems pretty lively for a dead man," Sheriff Miller replied. "He's staying at the hotel in town. Says he's coming out here tomorrow to collect his wife." Lucas could see Julia struggling to maintain her composure. "Sheriff," he said, turning back to Miller, "I'd appreciate if you'd tell Mr. Harrington that Miss Zellinger is under my employment and protection. If he wishes to speak with her, he can do so here, tomorrow afternoon, with me present." After the sheriff departed, Lucas closed the door and turned to find Julia already moving toward her room, her steps quick and panicked. "Miss Zellinger," he called after her. "Julia, please." She stopped but didn't turn around. "I think you owe me an explanation," Lucas said quietly. Slowly, Julia turned to face him. In the lamplight, he could see tears shining in her eyes. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I do." They returned to the table, where Julia folded her hands tightly in her lap. "Edward Harrington was my husband," she began. "We were married for 3 years in Philadelphia. He was not a kind man." Lucas had seen enough of the world to understand what she wasn't saying. "He hurt you." Julia nodded, her eyes fixed on her hands. "When word came that he had died in an accident at the ironworks, I felt free. I used the small insurance payment to travel west, to start a new life." She looked up at Lucas. "I changed my name back to Zellinger. I thought it was over. But he wasn't dead. No, he must have arranged it somehow. The insurance wasn't much, certainly not enough to fake his death for." She shook her head. I don't understand why he would go to such lengths, or how he found me. Lucas had encountered enough dishonest men to have his suspicions. Your father, you said he was an artist. Did he leave you anything of value? Julia's hand moved unconsciously to touch a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her collar. Only a few paintings and his gold pocket watch, which I kept for sentimental reasons. And Harrington knows about these items? Understanding dawned in Julia's eyes. The paintings. Father's work has become quite valuable since his death. Edward always said they would be worth something someday. Her voice hardened. That's why he's here. Not for me. Lucas felt a surge of anger toward this man he had never met. Tomorrow, when he comes, you don't have to see him. I can send him away. Julia shook her head. No, this has followed me long enough. I need to face him. She stood, smoothing her skirt with shaking hands. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Newell, but this is my problem to solve. As she walked toward her room, Lucas called after her. Julia, you're not alone in this. She paused, but didn't turn around. I have been alone for a very long time, Mr. Newell. Good night. Lucas barely slept that night, his mind filled with thoughts of Julia and the revelation that she was married, or believed herself a widow. He had spent months barely noticing her presence in his home, and now he couldn't stop thinking about her. About the quiet strength she must possess to have traveled alone across the country, starting a new life after escaping a cruel husband. About her remarkable talent and intelligence, hidden behind the role of a simple cook. Morning came, and with it, the routine of ranch life. Lucas went about his chores, keeping an eye on the road from town. Julia remained inside, though he occasionally glimpsed her watching from the windows, her expression tense. Mid-afternoon, a cloud of dust on the road announced the approach of a buggy. Lucas set aside the saddle he was mending and walked to the front of the house, positioning himself on the porch. The buggy pulled up, and a well-dressed man climbed down. He was perhaps 40, with the soft hands of someone unaccustomed to physical labor, despite his fashionable frontier attire that looked newly purchased. Mr. Newell, I presume, the man said, offering his hand. Edward Harrington. I understand you've been employing my wife. Lucas didn't take the offered hand. Miss Zellinger works for me, yes. Harrington's smile tightened. Her name is Julia Harrington, sir. I have papers to prove it. He patted his breast pocket. Now, if you'd kindly fetch her, we can be on our way before nightfall. Miss Zellinger isn't going anywhere she doesn't wish to go, Lucas replied evenly. And she'll speak with you when she's ready. As if on cue, the door opened behind him, and Julia emerged. She wore her best dress, a blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, and had arranged her hair carefully. Lucas noticed she carried herself differently, her spine rigid, her chin raised. She looked every inch the Boston-educated lady she was, not the quiet cook who had moved invisibly through his home. Edward, she said, her voice remarkably steady. Harrington's face broke into a broad smile. My dear Julia, what a chase you've led me on. When I heard rumors of a beautiful artist working as a cook in Wyoming, I could scarcely believe my luck. I thought you were dead, Julia said flatly. Harrington waved his hand dismissively. A misunderstanding. There was another Edward Harrington at the works, no relation. When I discovered the error, I tried to find you, but you had already disappeared. He took a step toward her, but Lucas moved slightly, blocking his path. I've come to take you home, Julia. This is my home now, she replied. And I am not your wife anymore. Not in any way that matters. Harrington's pleasant expression faltered. Now, Julia, don't be difficult. I still have our marriage certificate. He glanced at Lucas. Whatever arrangement you've made here, it cannot stand against the legal bond of matrimony. What do you want, Edward? Julia asked. After all this time, why seek me out now? Why? To reconcile, of course. A husband belongs with his wife. Harrington's gaze hardened. And a wife belongs with her husband, along with all her possessions. There it was, Lucas thought, the true reason for his appearance. My father's paintings, Julia said, confirming Lucas's suspicion. That's what you've really come for. They're rightfully mine, as your husband, Harrington insisted, along with anything else of value you've acquired. The law is clear on this point. Lucas had heard enough. Mr. Harrington, I suggest you return to town. Miss Zellinger has made her position clear. Harrington's face flushed with anger. This is none of your concern, rancher. She is my wife under the law, and I'll have the sheriff enforce my rights if necessary. Edward, Julia interrupted, her voice suddenly calm. The paintings were destroyed in a fire 3 months after I left Philadelphia. Harrington stared at her in disbelief. You're lying. I wish I were. They were in storage while I traveled. The entire warehouse burned. She met his gaze without flinching. There's nothing for you here. For a moment, Lucas thought Harrington might strike her. Instead, the man's face contorted with calculation. We'll see about that, he said finally. I'll be speaking with the sheriff. Don't think this is finished, Julia. He turned to Lucas. And you would do well to remember that harboring another man's wife has consequences. Without waiting for a response, Harrington climbed back into his buggy and turned toward town, leaving a trail of dust behind him. When he was out of sight, Julia's composure crumbled. She sat heavily on the porch step, her hands covering her face. Lucas sat beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Were the paintings really destroyed? Julia lowered her hands, revealing a grim smile. No, they're in a bank vault in Denver under my maiden name. But Edward doesn't need to know that. Clever, Lucas said with admiration. But he won't give up easily if he believes they're valuable. I know. He never does. She sighed, looking out across the ranch toward the mountains beyond. I should leave. I've brought trouble to your door, and you've been kind enough already. No, Lucas said, more forcefully than he intended. This is your home now. You said so yourself. Julia looked at him, surprise evident in her expression. It's employment, Mr. Newell. Nothing more. Perhaps it could be something more, Lucas said quietly, the words escaping before he could consider them fully. Julia stood abruptly. I should start supper. As she disappeared into the house, Lucas remained on the porch, wondering what had possessed him to make such a suggestion. Since Caroline's death, he had closed himself off from any thought of companionship. Yet in the space of a day, Julia Zellinger had transformed from his invisible cook to a woman of depth and courage who stirred feelings he thought long buried. But she was still, legally at least, another man's wife. And now that husband had returned, bringing complications that threatened the fragile peace Lucas had built on his ranch. Whatever his emerging feelings, they would have to wait. The sheriff arrived the following morning, looking uncomfortable as he dismounted. Lucas, he greeted with a nod. Is Miss Zellinger available? What's this about, Tom? Lucas asked, though he already knew. Sheriff Miller sighed. Harrington came to my office last night with his marriage certificate. It's legitimate as far as I can tell. He's demanding I enforce his rights as her husband. And what rights would those be exactly? Lucas asked, his voice hard. Under territorial law, a husband has claim to his wife's property and her return to the marital home. The sheriff looked genuinely regretful. I don't like it any more than you do, but I'm sworn to uphold the law. Julia appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. It's all right, Sheriff. I'll speak with you. As Julia invited the sheriff inside, Lucas felt a growing sense of helplessness. The law was not on Julia's side, regardless of Edward Harrington's character or intentions. Unless they could find a way to prove the marriage invalid or secure a divorce, nearly impossible given the restrictive laws, Julia would be legally bound to a man she had fled from. Through the open window, Lucas could hear fragments of their conversation. The sheriff explaining Harrington's legal claims, Julia's calm but firm responses, the mention of abuse that the sheriff acknowledged sympathetically but noted wasn't grounds for dissolving a marriage under territorial law. When Sheriff Miller finally departed, promising to return the next day for Julia's decision, Lucas found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a blank page in her sketchbook. What will you do? He asked, taking the chair opposite her. Julia's hand moved across the page, creating swift, angry lines. I won't go back to him. I'd rather run again. And start over somewhere new? Always looking over your shoulder? Lucas shook his head. There has to be another way. There isn't. Not legally. Her pencil stilled. Unless I had a protector whose legal claim superseded Edward's. A protector? Julia met his gaze directly. A husband. Lucas felt as though the air had been knocked from his lungs. You're suggesting a marriage of convenience, Julia clarified quickly. Nothing more. Edward can claim a wife, but not another man's wife. If I were to remarry, believing in good faith that my first husband was dead, would that even be legal? The law recognizes marriages conducted in good faith, even if one party was previously married. as long as they believed their spouse was dead. It's called a putative marriage. She gave a small, sad smile at his surprised expression. I've had time to research this, Mr. Newell. Lucas ran a hand through his hair, trying to process what she was proposing. Who would you marry? Julia looked down at her drawing. A rough sketch of Lucas himself, he realized with a start. I had thought, perhaps you. For appearance's sake only, of course. Once Edward gives up and leaves, we could quietly dissolve the arrangement. The practical part of Lucas's mind recognized the logic in her plan. A marriage, even one of convenience, would provide Julia with legal protection. Yet something in him rebelled against the idea of a marriage in name only, particularly to a woman who had begun to awaken feelings he had thought long dead. I won't make such a decision hastily, he said finally. Neither should you. Julia nodded, closing her sketchbook. Of course. I merely wanted to present the option. She stood, her expression once again composed into the professional mask he had grown accustomed to. I'll have dinner ready at the usual time. As she turned to the stove, Lucas found himself studying her with new eyes. The graceful way she moved about the kitchen, the intelligence behind her quiet demeanor, the courage that had brought her across the country alone. In the months she had worked for him, he had barely looked at her. Now he couldn't look away. That evening, as Lucas sat alone on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and purple, he came to a decision. He would help Julia, not through a false marriage, but by finding a legal way to free her from Harrington. With his own father having practiced law back east, Lucas had connections he could utilize. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. Lucas stood, reaching for the rifle he'd left propped against the wall. In the fading light, he could make out 3 men on horseback coming up the road. Edward Harrington rode at the front, flanked by 2 rough-looking men Lucas didn't recognize. None of them wore the friendly expression of social callers. Evening, Newell, Harrington called as they drew near. I've come for my wife and her property. Lucas remained on the porch, rifle now in hand, but pointed at the ground. Sheriff Miller said you'd return tomorrow. I grew impatient. Harrington dismounted, followed by his companions. These gentlemen are deputies from Denver, here to assist me in recovering my wife and the valuable artwork she stole from our home. Lucas's eyes narrowed as he assessed the men. Their worn clothes and unshaven faces hardly suggested law enforcement. I'd like to see their credentials. One of the men spat tobacco juice onto the ground. We ain't here for your approval, rancher. The lady comes with us, nice and peaceful like, or there'll be trouble. The door opened behind Lucas, and Julia stepped out. She had changed into a traveling dress and carried a small valise. Julia, what are you doing? Lucas asked, not taking his eyes off the 3 men. Preventing bloodshed, she replied quietly. They'll hurt you to get to me, Lucas. I won't have that on my conscience. Harrington smiled triumphantly. A wise decision, my dear. Come along now. Julia descended the porch steps, her back straight, her expression resolved. As she passed Lucas, she pressed something into his hand, a folded piece of paper. Don't, Lucas said, his voice low and urgent. You don't have to go with him. Julia looked up at him, and in her eyes Lucas saw not defeat but determination. Trust me, she whispered. Before Lucas could respond, one of Harrington's men grabbed Julia roughly by the arm and pulled her toward the waiting horses. You'll regret this, Harrington, Lucas called, his hand tightening around the rifle. Harrington merely tipped his hat. I doubt that very much. Good evening to you, Mr. Newell. I suggest you forget you ever met my wife. As the 3 men rode away with Julia between them, Lucas unfolded the paper she had pressed into his hand. It was a page torn from her sketchbook, hastily written on. They're taking me to the Broken Spoke Hotel in town. Not leaving until morning. The paintings are hidden beneath the floorboards in my room, under the bed. Bring Sheriff Miller. Tell him to look for forgery marks on the marriage certificate. The date has been altered. Lucas wasted no time. Within minutes, he had saddled his horse and was riding hard toward town, taking a shortcut through the hills that would get him there before Harrington's group. His mind raced with worry for Julia and anger at himself for letting her go. Whatever plan she had, he intended to ensure she wouldn't face it alone. The town of Bitter Creek was quiet when Lucas arrived. Most businesses closed for the night except the saloon and hotel. He tied his horse at the sheriff's office and pounded on the door of the adjacent living quarters until a bleary-eyed Tom Miller appeared. Lucas? What in blazes? Harrington took Julia. Lucas interrupted, thrusting Julia's note at the sheriff. He showed up with two men claiming to be deputies from Denver. Sheriff Miller read the note, his expression darkening. I didn't authorize any deputies to assist him. He reached for his gun belt. Let me get dressed. We'll check that marriage certificate. While the sheriff prepared, Lucas hurried to Julia's room at the ranch house. It took only moments to find the loose floorboard under her bed. Beneath it lay a leather portfolio containing 3 canvases wrapped in oilcloth. Lucas tucked them under his arm and returned to town as quickly as he had left. By the time he reached the Broken Spoke Hotel, Sheriff Miller was waiting outside, his expression grim. Harrington and his men arrived about 20 minutes ago, the sheriff said quietly. They've got Julia in a room upstairs. The desk clerk says they've been drinking heavily since they checked in. Lucas felt cold fury building inside him. What about the certificate? I sent a telegram to Philadelphia before they arrived. Got a reply confirming Julia's suspicions. Their marriage ended when Harrington was declared legally dead 2 years ago. He must have altered the dates on his copy of the certificate. The sheriff checked his revolver. That makes this a kidnapping, not a domestic matter. Relief washed over Lucas, followed quickly by renewed concern for Julia. What's your plan? We go in, identify ourselves as the law, and demand Julia's release. If they resist, the sheriff left the sentence unfinished. Lucas nodded grimly. Lead the way. The hotel was quiet as they entered, the desk clerk nervously pointing them toward the staircase. Room 3, he whispered. But be careful. They're in a mean mood. Sheriff Miller took the stairs quietly, Lucas following close behind. Outside room 3, they could hear male laughter and the sound of glass clinking. The sheriff motioned for Lucas to stand to one side of the door, then knocked firmly. Who is it? Came Harrington's slurred voice. Sheriff Miller. Open up. There was a scrambling sound inside, followed by hushed voices. Finally, the door opened a crack, revealing Harrington's flushed face. Sheriff? What brings you by at this late hour? Step aside, Harrington. I'm here for Miss Zellinger. Harrington's expression hardened. That's Mrs. Harrington to you, and she's not going anywhere. Sheriff Miller pushed the door open wider, his hand on his revolver. I've confirmed your marriage certificate has been altered. Julia Zellinger is a free woman, and you're detaining her against her will. As the door swung fully open, Lucas caught sight of Julia sitting rigidly in a chair, her eyes wide with relief at seeing them. The 2 false deputies stood nearby, hands hovering near their weapons. This is absurd, Harrington blustered. I have rights. You have the right to explain yourself to a judge, Sheriff Miller interrupted. All 3 of you are under arrest for kidnapping and fraud. One of the men made a sudden move for his gun. Sheriff Miller drew faster, his revolver leveled at the man's chest. I wouldn't. Lucas stepped into the room, moving quickly to Julia's side. Are you hurt? He asked softly. She shook her head, though Lucas could see a bruise forming on her cheek. You found the paintings? Yes. They're safe. While Sheriff Miller disarmed Harrington and his accomplices, Lucas helped Julia to her feet. She swayed slightly, leaning against him for support. You came for me, she whispered. Lucas tightened his arm around her. Did you doubt I would? The look she gave him made his heart race. No, she said. Not for a moment. With Harrington and his men in custody, the sheriff escorted the group to the jailhouse. Julia provided a statement detailing how Edward had faked his death to collect insurance money, then tracked her down when he learned her father's paintings had increased in value. The telegram from Philadelphia confirmed that Harrington had been legally declared dead, dissolving their marriage, and that he was now wanted for insurance fraud in Pennsylvania. They'll be transferred to Denver tomorrow, Sheriff Miller told them as they prepared to leave. From there, Harrington will likely be extradited back east to face charges. You're free to go, Miss Zellinger, though you may need to testify eventually. Julia nodded, exhaustion evident in her face. Thank you, Sheriff, for everything. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Julia seated in front of Lucas on his horse, her body warm against his chest. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. What will you do now? Lucas asked as they neared the ranch house. With your freedom secured, I mean. Julia was silent for a long moment. I don't know. Continue west, perhaps. I still haven't seen California. Lucas felt an unexpected pang at the thought of her leaving. You could stay, he said, the words coming out before he could reconsider them. Not as my cook, but what? Julia asked when he didn't continue. The ranch house came into view, a single lamp burning in the window that Julia must have left lit before Harrington arrived. It looked like home in a way it hadn't since Caroline died. Lucas reined the horse to a stop in front of the house, but made no move to dismount. I've been alone for a long time, he said carefully. I thought that was what I wanted, what I deserved after losing Caroline and our daughter. Julia remained silent, waiting. Then you came, and I hardly noticed you. You were just the woman who cooked my meals and kept to herself. He drew a deep breath. Until I saw your drawings. Until I really saw you. Julia turned slightly to look up at him, her expression unreadable in the starlight. And what did you see? The most beautiful woman in town, hiding behind an apron and a quiet demeanor. A woman of extraordinary talent and courage. Lucas's voice grew softer. A woman I could love if given the chance. Julia's breath caught. Lucas, I'm not asking for an answer tonight, he said quickly. You've been through too much. But I am asking you to consider staying. Not as my cook, not as my protection against a false husband, but as yourself. Julia Zellinger, artist. And perhaps, someday, if you find you could care for me, as something more. They dismounted in silence, Lucas helping Julia down from the horse. As they stood facing each other in the yard, Julia reached up to touch his face gently. I'll consider it, she said, a small smile curving her lips. But I should warn you, I expect to take my meals at the table from now on. Lucas laughed, relief and hope washing through him. I wouldn't have it any other way. 1 year later, the Newell ranch looked markedly different. The house had been expanded, with a bright studio added to the east side to catch the morning light. Inside, Lucas sat at the breakfast table reading a letter while Julia poured coffee. Good news? She asked, noticing his smile. From the gallery in Denver. They've sold another 3 of your paintings. The owner asks if you'll consider a dedicated exhibition next spring. Julia's eyes lit up as she sat beside him. Really? That's wonderful. Lucas reached across the table to take her hand, his thumb brushing over the simple gold band on her finger, a match to the one he now wore. I told you they would appreciate your work. You've always seen more in me than anyone else, Julia said softly. Not true, Lucas countered. I was blind to you for months. The most beautiful woman in town worked as my cook, and I barely looked at her. Until you finally saw her true worth? Julia teased, echoing the words Lucas had spoken in his marriage proposal 6 months earlier. No, Lucas said, bringing her hand to his lips. Until I finally saw my own worth through her eyes. You made me live again, Julia. That's the true gift. Outside, the Wyoming sun rose over the mountains, bathing the ranch in golden light. Inside, Lucas Newell and his wife Julia began another day together, the shadows of their pasts finally giving way to the promise of their shared future.